Hej och välkomna till Ntd Nyheter. Jag heter Dan Alfjorden. Här är våra rubriker. Kan europeiska digitala regleringar påverka yttrandefrihet och amerikansk innovation? Hearing i USAs kongress. Trump uppmanar Europa att minska importen av rysk olja. Xi och Putin hördes diskutera organtransplantationer under militärparad i Peking. En tillbakablick på Charlie Kirks liv och karriär. Påverkar europeiska digitala regleringar yttrandefriheten och amerikansk innovation? Kongressen fick höra vittnesmål om gripanden på grund av inlägg i sociala medier och varningar om att dessa europeiska lagar kan få global påverkan som ett censurverktyg. En utfrågning hos USAs representanthus justitieutskott onsdagen den 3 september granskade hotet mot amerikansk yttrandefrihet och innovation från europeiska lagar med fokus på digitala lagar som leder till censur av både amerikaner och amerikanska företag. Kongressledamot Jim Jordan sa att Europa borde minska byråkratin för att låta det fria näringslivet blomstra.
But these attacks on American companies won't result in a so-called European champion. Instead, China wins as Europe hurts both itself and America.
Han menade att de europeiska regleringarna snedvrider den digitala marknaden och att lagar som EU:s Digital Services Act och Storbritanniens Online Safety Act hotar yttrandefriheten runt om i världen. Politikern och ledaren för partiet Reform UK, Nigel Farage, beskrev situationen för yttrandefriheten i Storbritannien.
I first became worried about all this with cancel culture. You know, the idea that we can't have this speaker go to a university because some people might be offended by what he or she have to say.
Farage menar att det har gått mycket längre med flera uppmärksammade gripanden.
We of course have Lucy Connolly, who put out an intemperate tweet after the savage murder of those 3 beautiful young girls. She removed it 3.5 hours later, sentenced to 31 months.
Connolly har sedan dess frigivits, men Farage berättade att restriktionerna mot henne hindrade henne från att närvara vid förhandlingen. Det senaste fallet är gripandet av den irländska komikern Graham Linehan efter 3 könskritiska inlägg. Linehan uppgav att polisen ställde starkt ideologiska frågor med språkbruk som används av transaktivister. Den brittiska premiärministern sa att det var ett operativt beslut av polisen som bör fokusera på allvarliga brott, medan chefen för Storbritanniens Metropolitan Police sa att oklarheter i lagen gör att poliser hamnar mitt i giftiga kulturkrigsdebatter. Den juridiska rådgivaren Lorcan Price misstänker att europeiska lagar som Digital Services Act, DSA, har ett underliggande politiskt motiv.
And a lot of what I think is inspiring the DSA is what we saw from Germany beginning after the election of President Trump and after Brexit, which is to control the narrative, slow down speech. And into that then they're throwing a very wide net out that's affecting all kinds of legitimate speech. We talked about my client Päivi Räsänen in Finland, who's prosecuted for sharing a tweet from the Bible. It's absolutely outrageous, and that becomes now the standard that the DSA will set, not just for Europe, but possibly and predictably globally.
Price sa att EU strävar efter att sätta den globala standarden när det gäller yttrandefrihet.
And because of the laws that I just outlined in Europe, the type of prosecutions we're seeing, it's an extremely low standard. It draws, I would suggest to you, a digital curtain where once there was an iron curtain. And US companies bear the brunt disproportionately of this. They're hijacked by the DSA to become essentially the EU's global censorship police, whether they like it or not.
Han sa att demokrati kräver yttrandefrihet och att man måste ta ställning mot denna våg av censur. President Donald Trump uppmanade europeiska ledare att stoppa inköpen av rysk olja som finansierar kriget i Ukraina och uppmanar dem att utöva ekonomiskt tryck på Peking för att de stödjer Kremls krig. Trump deltog virtuellt i toppmötet med Ukrainas främsta allierade, den så kallade De Villigas koalition, som anordnades i Paris den 4 september av Frankrikes president Emmanuel Macron. Tiffany Meyer på Ntd Evening News pratade med Grant Newsom, senior fellow hos Center for Security Policy, om detta.
President Trump today took part virtually in a summit of Ukraine's top allies known as the Coalition of the Willing. It was hosted in Paris by French President Emmanuel Macron. Joining us now to discuss the key takeaways from that meeting is retired U.S. Marine Colonel Grant Newsham. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Grant, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Now, during his virtual participation, President Trump told EU leaders that President Putin is capitalizing on their importing of Russian oil. Eurostat reports that in the first quarter of this year, Europe bought $1.7 billion worth of Russian oil, compared to $16.4 billion they bought in the same quarter of 2021. Now, what other sources does the EU have, as in what would it take to cut off that final trickle of Russian oil?
Well, they're going to have to get their own energy house in order. And some countries, for example, have, like the Germans, have shut down their nuclear power plants. They've shut down coal power plants. And once you do that, you've got to get energy from somewhere. And you have other countries in the EU which have similar problems. So they're going to have to buy the energies from someplace. And the United States is rolling in oil, natural gas. No reason they couldn't get it there. But you've got to find alternative sources. But this is the outcome of the Europeans getting into bed with the Russians when it came to their energy sources. And the idea was that would be what they would be buying forever. How short-sighted can you be? So they're going to have to really sort of buckle down to get rid of this last dependency. And also keep in mind that some of the energy that comes into the EU is actually sort of laundered through Turkey and or India. But they're making progress. But when you think about it, the Europeans have been funding Putin's war in Ukraine to some extent. That is just crazy.
Now, since the war began, India and China have ramped up their oil imports from Russia. Would cutting off China from Russian oil have a greater impact on Putin's war effort?
Oh, much greater. And it's not just oil and energy that the Chinese have been buying. It's the other material support, the technological support, the approval they give to the North Koreans to go all out on supporting the Russians. China is really the center point if you're going to go after this. Picking on the Indians is easy, and the Trump administration has been picking on them. Yes, the Indians shouldn't be buying as much from the Russians as they are, but the real problem is China. It's not the Indians. The Indians are our friends, and we shouldn't be driving them away. But China is the key, and you will notice that the Americans really haven't done anything to crack down on the Chinese while they've been leaning on the Indians. And in this meeting, of course, Mr. Trump told the Europeans to get tough on China as well. So hopefully we'll start getting tough on them too.
I want to get to China more, but first, Francis Macron said after the summit today that if Russia continues to reject peace talks, there would be new sanctions in coordination with Washington. What could that look like?
Well, it would be a complete sort of cessation of trade and business with Russia. You know, we've been talking about oil and energy, but the Europeans have been buying some other things from the Russians as well. You'd be surprised just how much business does get done. The Americans have done a pretty good job of cutting off most commercial dealings with the Russians. The Europeans still have a long way to go, but you will also note that President Macron, he also said, if the Russians don't do this, the Europeans will. Well, the war's been going on 3 years, and he's talking about something they might do if the Russians don't end the war. You know, it's about time that they move ahead with this.
Now, expanding on your earlier point, President Trump also said there needs to be coordinated economic pressure on China for also assisting Moscow. We just saw Putin in China for the military parade there. Talk to us more about China's role in helping Russia so far.
Sure. Well, almost from the first day of the war, the Chinese have been providing aid to the Russians. The Biden administration actually suppressed that information for a long time. But there were sort of blacked out flights going from China into Russia with some sensitive technologies necessary to let Mr. Putin run his war. And Chinese have provided hardware, technology, dual-use technologies that are essential for operating a modern military. And as I said, they have allowed the North Koreans to go ahead and provide ammunition, artillery shells, and at least 10,000 troops to support the Russians. So Chinese support has been full-throated. and they haven't let up. Also, the drones that get mentioned a lot, that are a big part of the Russian war effort. The Iranians provide a lot of those. The Chinese buy 90% of Iran's oil, or Iran uses that money to build the drones, send them to Russia. There's Chinese components in all of these drones, and now the Chinese are sending fully made drones to Russia, and pretty much saying to the Americans, well, what are you going to do about it? They're not even hiding the support that they've given.
And given all of that, what would economic pressure on China look like, considering that the U.S. hasn't yet struck a trade deal with China?
Well, the first thing you would do is you would pull the People's Bank of China's license to operate in the U.S. dollar system, and then go on to the next 10 Chinese financial institutions. That would cause them some trouble. And then you've got to really cut technology exports to China. You would put a block on any sort of Chinese investment in the United States. You would force divestment of Chinese interests, say land that they own, stocks they've got listed on U.S. exchanges. You just end that. And you would expose Xi Jinping and the top CCP, Chinese Communist Party leadership's obscene wealth, much of it stashed in the United States, in Canada, the United Kingdom. Those are some things you have to do, but the idea that somehow you're going to continue normal economic relations with China while China is funding and supporting the Russians, that is illogical. And it's pretty much a guarantee that we're not going to win. And as is widely reported, the Chinese said the other day, well, we're glad to have the Ukraine war going because it distracts the Americans. It doesn't let them focus on Taiwan, on the Western Pacific, or on China. So it's in China's interest to keep the Ukraine war going. So why exactly would we fund this? Why would we give China the wherewithal so that they can then support Putin against the Ukrainians? I think that question pretty much answers itself.
Well, Grant Newsham, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Under en stor militärparad i Peking den 3 september fångade en aktiv mikrofon upp den kinesiska kommunistledaren Xi Jinping och Rysslands president Vladimir Putins samtal om att förlänga sitt liv. De diskuterade möjligheten att leva upp till 150 år tack vare framsteg inom bioteknik och organtransplantationer i Kina. Putin och Xi gick mot podiet vid Himmelska fridens torg där de sedan såg på paraden. Ögonblicket direktsändes både i kinesisk statlig media och internationell media. Putin bekräftade senare för journalister att han faktiskt diskuterat livslängd med Xi. Nordkoreas ledare Kim Jong-un log och tittade i riktning mot Putin och Xi, men det var oklart om samtalet översattes för honom. Människorättsorganisationer har upptäckt att den kinesiska kommunistregimen under 2 decennier har använt sig av påtvingad organskörd från levande samvetsfångar i stor skala. Organen har sålts med vinst till personer i behov av transplantationer, inklusive utländska besökare. Bland offren finns falungongutövare samt etniska och religiösa minoriteter. Efter nyheten om Putins och Xi Jinpings samtal om organtransplantationer och odödlighet svarade representanthusets talman Mike Johnson på en fråga som ställdes av Ntd på morgonen den 4 september.
Melina with Ntd, thank you for answering the question. So at China's military parade today, China's Xi and Russia's Putin were heard on a hot mic discussing organ transplantation and its mortality. We know that China has continuously harvested organs by prisoners of conscience. What's your initial reaction to them being heard discussing such a thing, and how you all in the House are lobbying the Senate to pass the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act?
Yeah, I will tell you that we've heard some horrific stories of these organ transplants and all of this in China, that they take it from unwilling donors, okay, to put it mildly. And the fact that they were caught on a hot mic, first I've heard of that, is very telling. It tells you what their worldview is in contrast to ours. Speaking of evil, we've heard of, terrible stories. I've heard terrible stories of the Uyghurs, for example, this persecuted religious minority that they're using to harvest organs from. I mean, look, I've not seen the evidence of that, but if the leaders are talking about it, it should alarm us. The United States, we're going to stand for morality and ethics, and we're going to stand against that. There's legislation, as you know, that would address it, and we might need to put that at the top of the priority list if that's what's happening. So that's news to me.
Tidigare i år röstade USAs kongress igenom lagen Stop Forced Harvesting Act med en överväldigande majoritet, 406 röster mot 1. Lagen syftar till att straffa alla som är inblandade i påtvingad organskörd, inklusive kinesiska läkare och tjänstemän. Den väntar nu på godkännande i senaten innan den kan bli lag. Ntd's Tiffany Meyer samtalar om händelsen med Dr. Jessica Russo, rådgivare inom mental hälsa och styrelseledamot för Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, och Jan Jekelek, chefredaktör för The Epoch Times och programledare för American Thought Leaders.
And joining us now to share their insights on the situation, we have Dr. Jessica Russo. She's a mental health advisor and board member for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. We also have Jan Jekelek. He's a senior editor at the Epoch Times and the host of American Thought Leaders. Jan has been covering the forced organ harvesting issue over the last 20 years. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Killed to Order, China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. Thank you both so much for joining us. Dr. Russo, first, what was your reaction to this hot mic moment, and where do you think these organs are coming from?
I think it was really stunning, and I think it was actually an inadvertent admission of what we have known to be happening since 2006. It is very clear that the Chinese government is harvesting organs from unwilling donors. And there was something back in 2019, this was about a 1-minute clip from a military hospital in China that made it very clear that top Chinese officials are getting multiple organs to prolong their lives. So we're hearing this again. And it was actually during the COVID pandemic where we heard something about someone in the top echelons of the CCP who had died and had multiple organs. So we know what's happening in China. The donation rate is extremely low. We know these are coming from unwilling people, their own citizens.
And Jan, your reaction to the hot mic moment?
I mean, it's kind of shocking that somehow this got hot mic'd. But, you know, we've known for basically since 2006 that this horrific practice of taking organs, you know, involuntarily from prisoners of conscience is happening. And, you know, the thing that just struck me so hard is it's really just been the cost of inaction that has, you know, allowed this to basically keep going. There's ways to kind of slow it down at least, if not stop it. But this is, I mean, it even hit me hard, and I've been covering this, as you said, for 20 years. It's unreal.
And Jan, staying with you quickly, the London-based China Tribunal concluded in 2019 that Falun Gong practitioners were the primary victim group of forced organ harvesting in China. Now, this ties directly to the transplant industry that Xi has perhaps unwittingly put under the spotlight. Could you walk us through more of the China Tribunal's findings?
Well, the China Tribunal was extremely important. It was actually a comprehensive review of all the evidence that had already been found, and also finding, you know, basically the experts that were out there and even some whistleblowers who hadn't come forth before to basically put together the comprehensive picture of what happened. It was, you know, run by Sir Jeffrey Nice. It was something that he prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic back in the day. And it was done, wasn't done under legal authority, but it was done as if it were done under legal authority with kind of the highest bar for evidence. And just, you know, a few of the things they found, I mean, the sort of the best estimates for the number of organs being transplanted, something 60 to 100,000 a year. You know, and really with no real credible organ donation sources. I mean, as of 2015, there's supposedly some kind of real organ donation system that's happening, but work has actually shown by researchers that these numbers are kind of a perfect quadratic equation. So basically they invented the numbers. So that's a huge amount. Add that up. You know, we've got incredibly short wait times. I mean, people were going to China within 2 weeks and scheduling a heart transplant. So you know when someone's going to be dead. And this is not one instance. This is many instances. There's also this kind of massive infrastructure development that happened immediately after 99. So this is why that's relevant. The persecution of Falun Gong practitioners was initiated by the Chinese Communist Party in 1999. And there was already this killing of prisoners for organs happening. But what happens right at the time when the Falun Gong persecution begins, when the CCP starts that, is this massive, massive growth. To kind of illustrate it, I pulled a number here. I think in 1999, there were 22 liver transplant centers that existed in the country. By 2006, it was something like 500. So, just massive, massive growth, again, with no real credible organ donation source. And they would tell people that it's actually executed prisoners that are people are getting killed for these organs. They would admit that. What they wouldn't admit is that it's actually completely innocent people, prisoners of conscience, that were put into the system, the labor camps and the jails, by the hundreds of thousands. Ultimately millions pass through that system, and a very, very vulnerable population because, they're not implicating their family members. They're not implicating their fellow practitioners. They're being tortured by the regime anyway. So people just disappear, and no one imagined that something as horrible as this could actually be happening to them.
And Dr. Russo, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting were the ones who actually coined the term forced organ harvesting. Talk to us about this horrific practice and what it entails.
Well, a lot of people think that this is black market organ trade that happens throughout the world, including in the US. But what is happening in China is very unique. The Chinese government is the only one in the world that's harvesting organs forcibly from donors, living donors. These are primarily Falun Gong practitioners. This goes back to 2006, all the evidence we have here. As Jan suggested, shortly right after the persecution of Falun Gong started in 1999, we see this boom in the transplant industry. We know that the donation rate in China is very, very low. It's about 0.03%, which is only about 300,000 people, just over that. The government had suggested in 2014 that by 2015, they would stop using criminal prisoners. They never acknowledged using prisoners of conscience. But this never happened. What we heard at some point during 2015 was that criminal prisoners would be in the donation list. Because, of course, they have a right to donate if they want. That was the idea. So the Chinese government has not made any kind of effort to stop what they're doing. And they're certainly not admitting that these are prisoners of conscience, primarily Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetans, House Christians. And like Jan suggested, the China Tribunal, and even before that, in 2016, there was a massive research project into what's going on in China in organ transplantation. And the numbers showed it was between 60 to 100,000 transplants they were doing per year. And with such a low donation rate, it can only be these prisoners of conscience, especially when the infrastructure has expanded so intensely right after the persecution. That's not a coincidence.
And Dr. Russo, House Speaker Mike Johnson telling NTD in response to the hot mic moment, quote, "It tells you where their worldview is in contrast to ours," adding, "If the leaders are talking about it, it should alarm us." What can we draw from these comments about the CCP's worldview?
They don't care about people. They have no ethics. The idea that we are working with them, that we have been trading with them since 2021, it's really unconscionable. It's so hard to believe that we would be working with such an inhumane government. I wouldn't even call them a government. This is a regime that's anti-human. So we really have to be careful. One of the things that really puts us in such a precarious position in the United States, as well as in many other Western countries, we are training Chinese physicians who will likely go back and commit these murders. And we have pharmaceutical companies in the West, primarily in the US actually, that are providing materials for China's transplants. And we have medical supply companies also providing materials and products for China's transplants. So we don't want to be complicit in this. There's a bill now that's in the Senate. It passed earlier this year in the House called the Falun Gong Protection Act. It's the first bill to address forced organ harvesting of the primary group, Falun Gong practitioners. And it not only will serve to save lives, but it will also help to protect U.S. interests. And this also includes patients who are going to be lured by China's short wait times, and you can get an appointment to get an organ within 2 weeks. You know, that's unheard of here. You can get a heart, you can get cornea, whatever you want, as long as you can pay the money for it. So we do not want to be complicit in this crime.
Dr. Jessica Russo, Janja Kellick, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Den unge konservative debattören Charlie Kirk sköts till döds mitt under en debatt på Utah University den 10 september. Som grundare till organisationen Turning Point USA var han en av Trumps närmast allierade och blev snabbt ansiktet utåt för en ny generation republikaner. Vi berättar här om hur Kirk blev en framträdande röst och vilket arv han lämnar efter sig.
Charlie Kirk gick från att vara en tonåring med ett brinnande intresse för politik till att bli en av de mest välkända konservativa rösterna i sin generation. Han hamnade i rampljuset första gången 2012 när en uppsats om liberal partiskhet i skolor blev viral och den då 18-årige Kirk framträdde på Fox News för första gången. Senare samma år grundade Kirk Turning Point USA, en organisation med syfte att främja konservativa värderingar på universitetscampus. Den växte snabbt till ett nationellt nätverk som gav unga konservativa en plattform de tidigare saknat. Kirks passion för att konfrontera liberaler på universitetscampus lockade inflytelserika konservativa finansiärer. Han fortsatte att debattera med liberala akademiker ända fram till slutet.
You let me talk. Well, you keep telling me not to interrupt you. I'm not interrupting you. That's what you think they do. I'm going to add some context to what you're saying.
I takt med att Turning Point växte fördjupades också Kirks relation med Donald Trump. År 2024 hjälpte Turning Points politiska gren till att leda Trumps kampanj för att få väljare till valurnorna i viktiga vågmästarstater. Kirk byggde även upp sin egen plattform genom sitt radioprogram och sin podcast. Kirk var känd för sina tal där han blandade politik med tro och han förklarade en gång att Amerika befann sig i en andlig strid. Kirk lyckades fånga essensen av vad som verkligen engagerar unga konservativa väljare. I en intervju med Epoch Times lyfte han fram sociala mediers påverkan och behovet av att överbrygga klyftan mellan yngre och äldre väljare.
They want a government that they can trust. I think President Trump is delivering on all these things. I mean, we got to lower interest rates. We got to build more homes. Honestly, more immediately, we need mass deportations. We need them very quickly. And I also think we got to clarify this Epstein stuff. This last week has not helped the cause, especially amongst lower propensity younger voters, especially young male voters.
Vid sin död endast 31 år gammal menar många att Kirk blivit synonym med MAGA-rörelsens ungdomsgren. Turning Point USA har idag avdelningar på över 800 universitetscampus. Charlie Kirk efterlämnar sin fru Erica och deras 2 små barn.
Tack för att du har tittat och på återseende. För alla ni som vill se våra nyheter och även hyra filmer, serier eller dokumentärer välkomnar vi er att besöka NTD Sveriges nya webbsida ntdtv.se.